Welcome everyone to the Health, Happiness and Planet podcast, where we explore different ways to boost our well-being, live a more fulfilling life and protect our planet. This podcast is sponsored by Wave Business Excellence Footprint, the digital training company that cares about your development and the well-being of this planet. You can find the courses for employees and managers under www.wave-bef.com. In today's episode, we're going to dive into the topic of how relationships can directly influence the quality of our life by making us happier and healthier. I am thrilled to introduce you to my amazing guest, Veronika Amaya, who is from Bavaria Germany and now lives in England with her husband. Veronika is a relationship coach and mentor. She supports couples to create deeper connection and polarity in their committed relationship. She also mentors and trains coaches who want to take their coaching skills to the next level. Before she started relationship coaching, Veronika worked as an emotional integration practitioner with Teal Swan's modality, the completion process. Now her focus is on relationship coaching. She is convinced that our relationship difficulties in adulthood are always connected with our experiences in childhood. And if we use our triggers and negative emotions to become aware of our limiting patterns from childhood, we can heal through our adult relationships. And ultimately, don't pass our limiting patterns onto our children. I am thrilled to introduce you to this amazing guest, Veronika. Well, first of all, Veronika, thank you so much for coming to this podcast, Health, Happiness and Planet. It's fantastic to have you here. And there is one question I love to ask all of the guests, and it's usually the same question at the beginning. It's what are you passionate about and how did you find your passion, or did your passion find you? How did that happen?
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, my big passion is really conscious relating, so relating with awareness, because just right now what we can see in society is that most people really struggle on that front. And we always have to remember that we are actually social beings, we love being in groups, but for many, many people it's very difficult at the moment. I found this real purpose to understand relationships and to help people find more joy and happiness in their relationships. And as so many people, coaches or therapists or also entrepreneurs, often the journey starts with pain. And that was the same for me. So for most of my life, I really struggled to connect with people. I always felt like a real sense of loneliness, even though I had a big family, many friends. And also I grew up in a household where my parents were fighting a lot. It really impacted me. Like I was always sick, even on a physical level, because everything is connected. And only when I found my now husband, which was the first, I think, person ever that I really felt safe with, actually my physical symptoms have been reduced. And now I'm more healthy than I've ever been. So I even saw this change on a physical level. Yeah. So I've seen it in my own life, how incredible it is to have better relationships. And now I want to help people do the same and also create this in their own lives.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. Especially, I think, when one is a child, one feels very helpless when you are watching and observing your parents arguing and you do not know why are they arguing. You might sometimes even think it's maybe your fault. It really does a lot on the nervous system for a child. Yeah.
Yes.
I think also what made it very obvious now for a lot of people thinking back to see how was it during the time when we had that pandemic and during the moments where everybody had to restrict their communication with others. And they did see what difference there is between being out there and seeing people, communicating with them, having great relationships, and just being at home for a period of time. And that was, I think, especially hard for very social people. For example, like right now where I was in Spain, I've seen a lot of people having problems throughout that pandemic. And it was just so amazing to hear their stories, how they suffered through that. And now they are just back to normal again. I think they're even hugging each other more than usual. So when you go to see your neighbors or if you go to see your friends here, they all just really hug you and they kiss you. And they're like, oh, it's so great that you came for lunch or for dinner. And they're just very, very social people, and they need that. They need that contact with others. And as you said, now that's part of who we are as human race. Yeah.
Absolutely.
One of the things I read the other day was about the blue zones. And the blue zone is where you have people over 100 years of age and they're also very healthy. So they started to identify what were the factors that influenced them to be so old and to still have quite a good health. And there were a lot of factors. One of them was the way how they were eating. And the other factor was their relationships, how they communicated and how did they interact as a community. How do you explain that this has such an impact on their health and their longevity?
I also read about this, I remember, and it was in Sicily because of a friend of ours. He is from Sicily, and I think this is one of those blue zones where people it's very normal to be 90 or 100 or something. And it's really interesting because especially when you study this culture, it's exactly that they have a very tight-knit community. They usually know the people all their lives. And they are really kind of like bathing in culture and connection usually. And what you have said before is so right. It's like connection and relationships is actually that our nervous system needs this very, very much. So it's really no coincidence that when you have great relationships, you have less anxiety, you have less depression, you feel more optimism, you feel more relaxed about life. And those are all factors that totally are connected with all these diseases that we see right now. Of course, also diet and lifestyle has a big influence in that. But many people, you could say, actually, they die of a broken heart, you know. Of course, also, if we get a little bit dark here, even, you know, like suicide rates, it's a massive, massive topic that we are not talking about enough. And that also is one of those problems that especially also influence younger people. So I think in those blue zones, people really are feeling connected. They know who they are and they feel that there's someone to support them, and that is like amazing for your health and for your happiness.
Especially that the communities, if I think about, as you mentioned now in Sicily, that's also very tight communities, so that if you are in a smaller town within Sicily, then you usually would take out your chair from your house and put it on the sidewalk and you would just sit there and you would just watch people walk by and then you would greet them. Yeah, if it's your neighbor or anybody else, people would just stop and have a conversation with you. And I would say for me, if I reflect now, going to different countries, you can measure the way of people, how they communicate with each other and in what intensity. For example, when I was living in Germany, in the place where I was in Frankfurt, the communication was quite low. So I did not feel, for example, where I was living in the building, that nobody really had the need to communicate with anybody. I was living there, that same building for 10 years, and I barely knew anybody. You know, nobody wanted to see me. And if you go to other countries, it's just the other way around. If you open the door, then suddenly everybody's opening their doors because they hear, somebody's at the hallway. I'm going to go out and say hello to them. How do you actually explain that phenomenon, like different countries and having those different types of habits?
It's really a cultural thing. It really fascinates me because I live now in England, and although, of course, the English and German culture, so I'm originally from Germany, English and German culture is quite similar, but still you see those bit differences. And for example, in England, you could say that people are always like embarrassed. Like this is the big fear that people have. So obviously then we want to avoid, like feeling any kind of embarrassment. That's why people really kind of like stay separated from each other. So that's one of their big values, is kind of like to keep the face. And that's also, I think, why in England, for example, people mostly socialize in pubs and around alcohol, because they need this social cushion. Because, of course, every human really, really needs to be in groups, to be connected, and to also show kind of like the real self. And then you see like this correlation in cultures where people are more, disconnected. Also, for example, the northern European countries, there actually the consumption of alcohol is often higher because they feel like they need this social lubricant. And in cultures, for example, like the Latin cultures or Italy or something, they also drink alcohol, but it's more kind of like moderate, maybe more here a glass and there a glass, because just culturally it's more accepted to be kind of like loud and be together a lot, to have maybe big crazy families, to also be angry, like in England, I think you would never see like a sober person just screaming around because they want to. It doesn't really happen. It would be very healthy for them though.
I did hear from some men who say that for them, going to the pub is much better than going to a psychologist or psychiatrist. And well, I couldn't understand because I don't drink any alcohol, but I could somehow relate because that's the moment of time that they have where they can just sit down and just have a conversation with somebody, and sometimes even deep conversations.
Yes, it's so true. And it's very interesting though, because my husband and I also stopped drinking like at the beginning of the year. And we have seen actually the beverages, the alcohol-free beverages, there's like alcohol-free wine and beer in the supermarket increasing. So I do think there is some sort of like wave happening slowly, because at some point it becomes just feeling very empty. For example, we have a lot of friends that we actually only see when we go out, right? So is it a real connection, even though we have also deep conversations when we are going out? But I think that more and more people are longing for this deeper sense of that, like you accept my faults and my flaws, also when we are sober, and I can open my heart to you. And I'm really curious how this is going to develop, and I really hope that this will continue, because I can see that, for example, the older generation, it's very difficult to connect with them because they often always had these barriers, like they never basically removed them. Like Matt's grandma, she's 80, she just came to visit, and it's like, when I talk to her, there's almost no connection point. It's like she talks and then I have to talk, but she doesn't ask any questions. And this is how the older generation very often communicate, because of course they have experienced lots of, intense experiences like the war. And so they are socially very disconnected from each other. And it's bleeding down the generations. But I think that right now people have more and more this real urge that they want to overcome these inhibitions to open up to each other.
Well, that's really excellent. It got me thinking about some other questions I have. Is there a difference in the communication on how the people feel with their health if they just have, let's say, the superficial type of talk, like how are you, how's the weather, and so forth, compared to the conversations and connection that you have with people who go like really deep into topics that it's like very, very at heart for those people? So those are those two options. But then if you have a third option, you have people who say, I go with my spouse, with my wife or my husband for a walk in the park, and we don't say a word to each other, but we feel extremely connected to each other. How do you see the differences to those three ways of connecting with people?
Wow, that's a really, really good question. So I think that a human being has different levels, right? Like there's like this intuitive feeling level, there's like the mental level, and there's the emotional level. And we exist in all those planes, and we also have needs in all those planes. In general, I think the more connection ability you have, so emotional, mental, and I would say spiritual, that's amazing, right? But of course, some people, they maybe feel that words are a bit empty, or maybe they had experiences around people that they can't really trust. So for them, they are like, I really just want to feel you. You can energetically open your heart, right? So if you are with a person that opens your heart, you can feel that. So I think that if a relationship is like this and both people really love that, I think there's nothing wrong with it. But some people have also other needs. So for example, for some people, it's super important to connect on a mental level. So for example, they either need to know the other person really deeply, that they share, but also that maybe they need to hear, hey, I love you, you're really important for me. And those are really valid needs. It's not that there's something wrong with you just because you need to hear this. And that often goes really deep, again, in childhood, because maybe a person has never really heard this from their parents. So there's lots of needs unmet. So it could be that if maybe a person is content with feeling connection and the other one needs to hear it, there could be a mismatch. And that's what we call in relationship coaching incompatibility. And that's a very real thing. And it's really important that you, as I said, don't try to force anything and don't think that there's something wrong with you or with the other person. It's just different needs, so to speak.
Yeah, and everybody has like their expectations are a bit different, yeah, depending on their past, on their history, and where they grew up, what's the culture. And one has that expectation, the other one has the other one. Even though they never thought it was meant in a negative way to hurt the other person, it's just that you do not understand yet their background. Yeah? And once I think they understand that, one can start moving more towards which is the center point. I would say, where are we going to be having our relationship? And I already know what is the expectations of my spouse and vice versa.
Yeah.
Wow, it's very good. And one of the things that interests me is, how do childhood experiences cause us to have relationship difficulties today as adults?
Very, very good question, very important question. So the easiest way to conceptualize of this is that the most important years to look at are the years from 0 to 7. Those are the years of imprinting. So your base personality gets formed in those years. So whatever you experience in the first 7 years has like really huge effects on your life later. So, and in terms of relationships, you can imagine that how you experienced relationships in your first 7 years, this makes your belief form about what to expect in relationships. So, for example, if you felt very unloved, very uncared for, very unheard, if you felt that you didn't matter, maybe you even felt like you were a bad person, that you were a really bad child, this is what you come to expect in relationships later. So it could be that you expect that people are not going to be there for you, that no one will love you, that no one is going to actually want to even be close to you. Or, for example, a lot of children obviously experience parents not being there for them. Maybe a parent dies, or a parent could not be there through work or through divorce or something. So they maybe expect that they are going to be left alone, which we could call abandonment trauma. Other children, for example, they have the opposite experience. Their parents are too much in their space, not giving them enough freedom. And they, for example, later really struggle to let people in, because as soon as someone comes closer, they get this fear that someone will overtake them and want to take their freedom away. And then later in life, basically, however your childhood was, if your parents were too clingy or not giving you enough attention, that's how you act. So, for example, a lot of people are very jealous or are very, very afraid that someone will leave them. This is usually the children that have experienced that parents were not really there for them, not giving them enough attention. Then there are some people who are terrified of commitment, they're like, oh my gosh, this is too much. Even, if you ask them to maybe call you once a day, they're like, no. And this is often these children when, for example, they had no privacy, the parents totally controlled them, and so on and so forth.
That's interesting, yeah, because I'm just thinking, for example, that what you see sometimes parents say to little children is like, you have here nothing to say, we are the adults speaking here at the table, so you just be quiet. Yeah, and then if a kid is growing up in that kind of environment, then they think, actually, my word is not valued. And then when they become an adult, they could become, I would assume, probably a little bit hesitant when they say something.
Yeah.
What is your experience on that example?
100%. Unfortunately, kind of like the parenting paradigm of the last 100 years is what I would call obedience training. Like you kind of train the child to be most convenient to you as parents and also to fit into society. And of course, as parents, you need to help the child to fit into society, because there are certain rules, if you don't teach them to, for example, not to strip naked in the streets, it could be dangerous, or also there could be really negative consequences. So it is important, but there is a way to do that without basically training them like dogs, so to speak. Because exactly what you said, if you train your child to always do exactly what you say, they are going to be later a person that really struggles to set boundaries, really struggles to say, hey, no, I don't want that, that's not acceptable. Or to also have the confidence to ask for what they want. So, for example, when I raise children, I want to do it really in a partnership paradigm. So I want to help them, navigate the world, coach them, tell them about culture, what is expected, and so on and so forth, but not kind of like diminish their little spirit, and also accept that sometimes they say, no, mom, don't come into my room. I don't want that. And then I say, hey, darling, I can really understand that, and I respect your privacy. So this is actually how you can help a child develop their own beautiful boundaries and know that it's not going to get punished if it has a different opinion than their parents. That's so important.
Wow, that's interesting. Especially for parents, it gets quite challenging once the child develops into the teenagehood, because the teenagers tend to communicate in a bit different way as they used to when they were children. Do you have any advice for parents out there who are maybe listening to this and do have a teenage child? What is the best way to communicate with them? Because it comes to a point that, if I remember right, and also what I've heard from my colleagues and what I also experienced myself, that when they're a teenager, usually whatever the parents say, it's not worth much anymore, because it's all just a joke what parents are saying, and they are the ones who know better and have their own fixed opinion on something. How do you think parents should deal with such a situation in that phase of their life?
Well, of course, parents, I want to say, I don't have children yet, so I talk easy. But from my experience, it comes all down to respect and trust. So I can totally understand that. I think many parents really struggle because teenagers become super disrespectful. But I maybe want to challenge them to see, are there ways in which you are also very disrespectful towards your teenager? For example, by not trusting them that they can actually make good decisions, by maybe commanding them around instead of encouraging them, helping them, assisting them, and by not taking them seriously. That's, I think, what so many teenagers struggle with. And we always have to remember that now childhood gets so crazily prolonged. Back in the days, people used to be responsible adults with 15. They maybe already had families, they already worked. So it's not like intellectually we're not able, but I think that often we don't really let go of the children and don't trust them, essentially. And that would be really my tip. And I think very often what happens is, if you start to be super respectful to your teenager, suddenly they start to give the same back, because it's very difficult to be rude to someone if they really always uphold this value of respect towards you.
Yeah, so it's like not to generate that snowball effect where one says something, then the other one says it even harder, and then the next one says it even louder, and the whole situation just gets out of hand and the snowball gets bigger and bigger. I think maybe in that sense, it's not good to fight fire with fire, but I would say just lead by example, to be the person who you hope that your child will be at some point of time when they're a grown-up, and to learn from how the parents do it.
Definitely. Just maybe to add on to this is that I think the difficulty of being a parent is that you have to be really the adult in the situation. And of course, your kids can trigger you. Your kids probably trigger you more than anyone else, because often they remind you of you when you were younger and so on. And of course, with teenagers, often a lot of fears come up, because you also have been a teenager. But I think that if you can make it so that you really stay calm and really remember that you are in this adult position, then you can, exactly what you said, you can model this behavior towards the teenagers. And maybe you can also just remember how it was for you. It's a really difficult time, this whole confusing things with being interested in boys and girls and having pimples and everything. It's an intense time. So I think we gotta be really kind to them.
And that's, I think, also what the difficult part, as you mentioned, for many parents, because I think the kids, as they've been their whole life with their parents, they know exactly what are the buttons they need to press. And then they know, okay, if I do that, they're just going to explode saying this and that. If I do the other thing, I know exactly how my parents are going to react. And that's, I think, where one, as a parent, would need to really try to catch yourself before you start reacting to those pressing the buttons, that you start really thinking, what do I feel at this moment, and how can I do to stop reacting the same way how I have reacted before? And I think that's probably the hard part for parents, because usually one thing, okay, adults, they need to know everything. They need to be the perfect ones, and the kids are the ones learning. But sometimes parents who are the adults are really challenging themselves in trying to find that harmony, of staying calm. And they just sometimes have that difficulty to not to be triggered. Do you have any tricks or tips that you can give somebody to say how to avoid getting triggered by your kid?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So maybe first of all, to explain what a trigger is. So a trigger is basically an emotional reaction that's not really appropriate to a situation. So for example, a trigger could be that your spouse or your child or something leaves the wet towel on the floor and you have this huge emotional reaction, like either you get really angry or you start crying. And so this towel in that moment it reminds you of something that has happened in the past. So, for example, it could be that you grew up in a super chaotic household and all this panic from childhood comes up, or you feel disrespected, or you feel uncared for, like anything from the past. So that's a trigger. And it's so important that we first of all recognize, wow, right now I'm being triggered, because the chances that you react like in a really mean way towards someone when you're triggered are super high. And of course, as you said before, you fight fire with fire, right? So maybe that act was really a little bit disrespectful or uncaring, but at the same time, if you like scream at someone, it's the same thing again. So I would first of all, notice what are the areas that I'm being triggered, and then think about, why does this particular thing trigger me so much? What does it remind me of? And then, for example, it's a really beautiful relationship enhancing idea if you then share this with the person, because it's so much more effective. Imagine someone comes to you and says, oh, darling, like so many emotions come up when I see this towel on the floor. And it is because in my childhood, my parents were so chaotic. I always felt really, really out of control. I didn't know when the next meal was going to be. All the time I felt this panic. So when I see this towel, that's what comes up for me. And I know you don't mean it, and I can imagine you just forget it. But could there be a way that we could maybe find a solution that would really help me? So imagine also how you are opening up in that moment, because so many parents, I think also, they think they have to hide everything from their children, when they have problems, when they are sad, when they are triggered. And of course, I'm not saying you should make your children your friends, but if you open up like this and just a little bit show them, this wounded parts of themselves, it will make your children much, much more connect with you. And the chances are so high that, first of all, you're going to feel much more connected with them, but also that they're going to be much more considerate around you, because there is suddenly this emotional story that they didn't have before. And I remember always when my parents opened up to me, like my dad, for example, said the other day that he can't remember a time that his dad ever hugged him, like no single time. Wow, my heart was opening so much, because my problem with my dad is that he can't connect with me on an emotional level, not as much as I would want it to. But hearing the story, I'm like, of course he can't, right? I mean, he never learned it. He had so much lack of connection in his childhood. So can you see how that brought us so much closer? And he didn't share a lot, just a few sentences, but immediately had a different feeling towards my father.
Yeah, that's an amazing story, especially that you can then really relate and understand why people are doing certain things in a certain way. Because if you do not know that, then you just have your own ideas of why are they that way. Maybe because they don't love you, maybe because, all these silly little things that come up in your little voice in your head. But then when you really listen to that from their point of view and why is that way, then you start seeing the truth, and then you start seeing all the puzzle pieces coming together.
Yes.
And
totally.
what I also liked was that you mentioned about sharing with the kids about how you feel every time they do certain things, because that also teaches them what actions are producing what kind of reactions on others. And I think many times as a child or maybe as a teenager, you do not know what that triggers out to a person when I do something. For example, especially now when I think about social media, before if you say to some kid on the playground, oh, you are whatever, some bad word, and then you see the reaction on the kid, and then you know, okay, if I do that, that's their reaction. They might cry, they might get angry, or they might just maybe jump on top of me, or whatever the reaction is. But if I do it on social media, then they can say bad things to others, but they do not always see what's the reaction on the other side. Maybe they see an emoji in a certain way, but sometimes I think they might lose maybe a little bit of touch and the feeling of what is it that I'm saying and how is it perceived. The same now as parents, if the parents could tell their children, look, every time you do that or say this is how I feel about it, then they know, okay, so I know the cause and effect. If I do that, then this happens. So that's really like training them a little bit to be more sensitive.
Definitely, exactly. It's the empathy training, so to speak, and that's also one of those emotion coaching elements that is so important to do in childhood already, because as you said already, it's also with this culture that we have that we don't really show when we have been hurt, But that's actually really important to model to the kids, right? So they see, oh, okay, this is how it feels, and then you can make it much bigger. It's not that you want to be like the victim or something, or that your child feels that they have power over you, but more like that you maybe make it into a whole thing, like thinking, oh, do you remember times when maybe someone did this to you? How did it feel for you? And so you train this empathy skills for them.
What I also think about how to catch yourself before you react on something is the fact when you practice meditation. And when you meditate, you should observe your thoughts. You should look at it as if you are a third person. And I think that's also like that helicopter view that one should maybe practice to see when somebody tells me something, if it's my child or my boss or colleagues, how do I react, and to observe it like as a third person, yeah, and to look at my thought, and then you can say, oh, that's interesting, what's happening there, and then you can somehow guide yourself better on what to do or how to respond to that situation.
Definitely. And I loved what you just said, because it's the curiosity. That's the most important thing in any kind of self-development or difficult situation in relationships. Because if you're really curious about what is happening right now, it's like a bit more this playful energy, because of course sometimes it can get really intense, if you have a fight with a loved one or something like this. But if you get curious, it's so much easier to see oneself. And I'm a relationship coach, and still I mess up so many times in my marriage or with my family or friends. And for example, there was a big realization that, especially actually if you are a professional, you need to be even more ready to see your flaws, because you can so easily get either on this high horse and think that everyone else is flawed and you're not, or alternatively, you can even convince people that it's their fault because you have all this language, to do so. So you can make like all these elaborate explorations. And I really see relationships actually as huge mirrors, So when something comes towards you, there's something within you that is being mirrored. So often when I think, oh, this person is so aggressive, I can't believe it, then I actually being aggressive in that moment, or I see an aspect of myself that I don't really like. So it's one of the most important things to be curious and to really see people actually as your spiritual teachers, guides, to help you become a more whole and loving version of yourself. We all have this potential within us, I think it's so beautiful to see what we can do if we really try. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, I haven't heard it in that perspective, and it really totally makes sense. Thanks for clarifying that for us. And it confirms for me, if I think about now the topic of this podcast, which is about happiness and being healthy, because if you can have a happy relationship, then also you will have less stress levels, yeah, and stress anyway will trigger lots of illnesses in people's bodies. So if you can be happy by having great relationship, automatically you're already doing something good for your health. Yeah, so it's really definitely all connected. And my next question, when we think about relationships, we usually think about relationships with our spouse, with our family and friends. But if we would go further, does this also have an impact on our business relationships with our peer colleagues at work, our manager or our employees, or even with our customers that we have in the business world? So would you say all of that, what we just discussed, it can be transferred to all the other types of relationships?
Absolutely. So you guys have probably heard about habits, that this is how people operate. We love to be on autopilot in all areas of life because the brain doesn't need so much energy, and energy in our evolution was very scarce. So in relationships, exactly the same thing. People love to operate in patterns. So if you have, for example, a pattern that you don't have good personal boundaries, which means, for example, you struggle to say no, you struggle to tell someone what you want, if someone is angry, you try to please them. If you have this in your personal relationships, very, very often you will have the same thing in your relationships at work. And that can really make your life hell. And I personally know so many people that have quit jobs because they failed to set boundaries with managers or bosses or even peers, because they find it so difficult to speak up and to say, hey, what you're doing does not feel good for me. It's not right. Can you please find another way to interact with each other? And for example, with customers, like I see this a lot in the coaching world, that, a lot of coaches, they have some sort of like background of some maybe pain in their life, right? That's why they want to help people. But then when they interact with clients, a lot of these things actually start bubbling up. So, for example, often the coaches or therapists used to be in the family, the child who used to help everybody. This is also how they became sensitive, because they always had this role of helping everybody. And then when it comes to their clients, they also can't set good boundaries. And for example, the clients would call them at 10 p.m. and they can't say no. They're like, oh, no, I have to call them, and so on and so forth. And of course, also on the other levels, a lot of people are also really not able to connect. And imagine you have a customer and you don't really listen to them, or you don't really let them finish a sentence. Maybe you don't hear what do they actually need. It's very difficult for you to actually make a product or a service that answers their problems and even just have a good kind of personal relationship, because people always want to buy from people. So I think that these relationship skills in all areas of business, if you work in a corporate world or you have your own business, are so important.
Oh, that's so amazing, because I just had some flashbacks on myself now as you were explaining that, because I was many years in the corporate world, and I remember that for me, this issue of always saying yes and not setting boundaries. And even if I think back when I was a teenager, I grew up with my grandparents, and my grandfather, he had a sign that he made himself where it said, do not say yes when you want to say no. So that was hanging in my room every day. And I was looking at that. Okay, I got to practice that. I got to work on that muscle. But it's still, I had to work on it when I was later in the corporate world, and I got better at it. Thanks goodness. But what I also noticed was that when I was speaking with a person one-to-one, I could connect extremely well with the person, and the empathy and the whole dynamics was great. And then as soon as there's a second, third, fourth person coming to the meeting, suddenly this whole dynamic just changed, and I became very quiet. And it's something that I was working on at the beginning of my career, where I was thinking to myself, how is that possible? When the person is with me one-to-one, it's so perfect. Everything is flowing magically. And as soon as 1, 2, 3 people come to the meeting, it's whoa, I cannot even say anything. I'm just quiet. I just let everybody else speak. So that was something that I just realized right now as you were explaining this.
And did you figure it out why?
I didn't figure out what was the root cause, but I just somehow got better at it. And I became later a senior manager. And they sent every senior manager to get all kind of support from people who analyze you. So they actually measure a lot of things on your performance. And one of my things that came up extremely high was the emotional intelligence. And my trainer said wow, actually, I haven't seen scores that high as with mine. And that's why I think I had a lot of hard time at the beginning, because every time I was in a meeting where there was many people, I was struggling with feeling everything what they were feeling. I could sense that this person is happy, the other person is bored, the other person is mad, the other person is confused. And I had to somehow process all of that. And then sometimes I would just be quiet, because I'm oh my gosh, I cannot fix now the situation because there's too much going on in the room. But if I can focus only on one person, then I can somehow say, okay, I know how this person is feeling. What do I need to say to make this person happier and joyful here in the meeting together with me? And I think that's probably a little bit that direction. What do you think?
Yeah, very good analyzed. I would say the same. So when I look at you, yes, I can see a high level of emotional intelligence, definitely. So people often think that we are kind of born with the sensitivity, but it's actually not true. So we are training it in childhood. So often people like us, I would say we are very similar in that sense, had maybe some intense caregivers, or just kind of people that we felt a little bit on edge around. So, for example, my father was I just use him as an example. So he's a lovely man. I love him to bits, but he is very intense in his emotions and unpredictable. Sometimes he would come back from work, he would hug me, he would be so happy I would be his little girl. Sometimes he would come home, he would not talk to me, he would be angry, and I was really frightened. And so I started to really focus on him to be able to predict in which mood he is, so I could protect myself, because maybe a few times in childhood I would run to him when he was angry, and then I would get pushed back, and that really hurt. And I had a lot of other people like that in my childhood. My whole family is a bit intense. Yeah, so it made me basically be able to get really, really sensitive to other people's emotions. And now I can basically, when there's someone 20 meters away, I know exactly what they're feeling. And that's really good in my job. But of course, you have to learn how to function in the world. So I could imagine for you, when you were in this meeting, it was really overwhelming. And also, you said an interesting word. You said, I can't fix it now, right? So that was kind of your self-assigned role that you need to fix with some sort of like outcome, maybe a harmony or something like this. But I think it's beautiful that you then learn that actually you have progressed this, because sometimes people get stuck, and that of course really stops your career. But that you learn, okay, I'm not a child anymore. I don't need to appease these people. I can still have my amazing skills, but maybe I can also become a bit more direct, a bit more harsh. And it's okay to also upset people sometimes.
Yeah, that's amazing, because in my case, I was able to later on practice that and to really somehow set certain barriers to know when do I allow the person's feelings get to me and how to avoid that it doesn't get to me too personally. And when I later on had a team, that was the time where I could even use it as a superpower, because I said every time I came to a meeting, I knew exactly how my people are doing. And then I knew, okay, I need to now make an icebreaker. I need to speak about different things. And then when we finished the meeting, I already knew, okay, which is the person who's still a little bit confused and which is the one who maybe needs me to explain it a little bit further, so that we could always then do these exercises together. And I always had a feeling that people really enjoyed being in my team, because at the end of each meeting was always like, okay, we're all feeling great now. And if somebody was not feeling great at the end of the meeting, I know that I need to work on that. And that's where I think for me it was a great advantage and helped me a lot in my career development in the corporate world.
I wish I would have been in your team. It sounds really amazing.
And well, I have other very interesting question. What do you think is the most important thing we need to do to have better relationships? Because there's so much advice out there. Nowadays you go into Google and you just type in something and you get like 1,000 different solutions. But sometimes one has to see, how do I cut through all of that jungle and just like get useful tools? And what is, from your point of view, one of the things that is really important to have?
Yes, I thought about this question before because, as you said, it's like such a big area. If you're at the beginning and you realize you're not very good at relating, I would say focus on two areas. And one is connection. So how can I be more connected with people? And the second one is, how can I have better boundaries? And they are also very connected with each other, actually, those two areas, because you could imagine a little bit, how can I let people either more in or push them away from me? Because this is usually what people struggle with, one or the other. And with the connection skill, I would say, learn how to listen. Like, that's one of the most important things, because we live in a society right now that is super active and where the value is on, how can I speak more? What can I say? How can I kind of like make myself heard? And then very often people actually, when someone else is talking, they're not going to even listen to what that person is going to say, but they already think about what will they say next. And this is such a simple thing, but so powerful. So, for example, as I'm having this podcast with Juan, when he speaks, I really take it in, and I even greet him, I look at his chest, I look at his face, how is he feeling, so that I can really see that other person that I'm having this conversation with, so that I actually can see him. So that's a very simple thing to practice. And then the other thing is boundaries. So boundaries means very simply your personal wants and needs. So what do you need in this situation to feel good, to feel better? And as we said before, if you, for example, spend the whole time in the office letting other people, like your colleagues, for example, talk in a way to you that makes you feel really uncomfortable, you are going to suffer so much. Or, for example, in your relationship, if you have this really deep need that you want to go on more walks together with your husband, but you never tell him, he cannot know, right? This is what boundaries are. So you have to tell other people what you want and what you don't want. So those are the two things. Learn really good boundaries and learn how to connect. And that will massively propel you to feel so much better. Yeah.
Wow, that's such a nice answer to that. One of the things that just reminded me while you were explaining that is the digital world. Just like today, you were saying that we're having this conversation and you're observing how I'm speaking and the body language and so forth. But some of it gets lost because of the digital world. And that's why for me, it's really hard to look at the camera right now because I do not see what you are doing or how you're reacting to my words. And that's why when you're speaking, I'm actually looking at the screen and I'm not looking at the camera because I'm trying to really observe how you are explaining. And while you're explaining it, I'm also already reading your emotions and how you're feeling. So all of this you cannot read so easily when you're in the digital world. And today, a lot of people are always communicating in the digital world instead of saying, hey, let's just get together and let's meet somewhere instead of just calling you on WhatsApp. And I think when you have the person in front of you in 3D, then you sense much, much more communication that's going through their body and even from the energy from the person. Because if I think about it, if I would be with my eyes closed and somebody would come into the elevator, I could probably tell if the person is mad or if the person is happy. So somehow these are things that you cannot perceive if you're in the digital world so easy, like when you are seeing the person in real. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. For me, it's the same thing. I really want to look at you, so I look at the camera. But it's also a matter, I think, of satisfaction because, I mean, the reason why I do these podcasts is because I really love to meet interesting people and connect with them. And it's definitely a disadvantage. But at the same time, I always find it very interesting to think about because I have a lot of coaches and therapists. And actually for them, the digital world has been so amazing also because I also do all my coaching online. And it's very incredible for me now how I can do really good work because, you know, I can read someone really well by seeing them. But of course, you could have a therapist or a coach that is at the other side of the world. But because maybe you love their personal medicine, you know, their energy, however they see the world. And I think in that respect, actually, from a mental health standpoint, I'm so glad that it exists because it has been more affordable and has been, I think, much more available. Even if you are in the same city, but you don't have to travel to someone. You know, during COVID, for example, I think online therapy like saved people's lives, literally, because they were suffering so much through the disconnection. So I always find it interesting with technology is definitely both, you know?
Yeah. That's probably where the planet part comes from this podcast. Yeah, the planet part is how do you do something good for the planet? In this case, we save a lot of transportation. And as you mentioned, you can really meet people all around the world. You don't have to now travel to India to meet a specific guru. You can see him straight on the screen. And that really opens a lot of opportunities because I always try to learn new things. And I had before, when I left Germany, private drumming lessons because I just said, okay, either I learn a new language or I learn a new instrument to just continue to challenge myself. In those days, I was in my 40s and I said, oh, let me try maybe to just learn to play the drums. And I had a drumming teacher. He was fantastic or is fantastic. Today, as I'm living in Spain, I'm thinking, oh, what a pity. I cannot drum anymore with this teacher, but we are still doing the drumming lessons through our Skype sessions. And he has all the cameras connected to the drums. And also I have those Bluetooth headphones on so I can hear exactly what he's doing. He's explaining me things. I see him on the screen. So I'm like, wow, that's amazing, the technology today. I don't need to be in a specific place and I can still connect with this person so amazingly.
Definitely.
So my next question, how do we create a team attitude in our relationship? Because I think that was one of the things I read on your website. Yeah. So when you have a relationship to create the team attitude, could you tell us more about this?
Yes. Oh, it's one of my favorite subjects. So when you think about couples, you know that often it seems like they are at war with each other. For example, the way they speak, they would never speak with another person as they are speaking with their spouse. Or they have to make a decision and they immediately start fighting with each other. Again, this is also something that often comes from childhood and also from the culture we have. But it is so destructive for relationships and especially also for an intimacy within a couple because it's so difficult if you have this constant conflict going on to then actually come together and share openly, you know, to be intimate because you need to be able to open up for that. And you're very likely never really going to feel fulfilled. And of course, if you are a family, it makes it very difficult for the children because they always feel it when the parents are fighting and you're just not going to have this enriching life. So I developed this concept which I call team attitude. First of all, it starts with the mindset that you always remember that this is the person you choose to be with. They have to have something amazing about them that you want to be with them, right? Yeah. So we just assume that they are on my side and that actually it's the two of us against the rest of the world, so to speak. So that's the team. And then you learn a process which helps you to change your defense mechanisms and basically drop them. Because what happens often in these moments when people are starting to fight each other over a topic, or even that they're rude against each other, is that something in them gets triggered, that they perceive the other person as an enemy and against them. But you can learn to realize all these defense mechanisms in me are activated, and I want to start fighting the other person, and then you stop this behavior. What you do, some people would become silent, not speak anymore. Others would become really loud. Others would leave the room. It's like all these little mechanisms that we have picked up, which have worked to protect ourselves, and we drop it because we remember the other person's our team member. And just by this act of dropping this defense mechanism, the whole situation becomes more safe. And then we can actually talk about what's really going on, Maybe you have some fears are coming up. For example, lots of couples fight about finances. It's usually because a lot of fears get triggered, So you talk about the fears. You're like, oh my gosh, when I see this bill, I get so afraid. Then you can take a breather together. And when the emotion has calmed down, then as a team, you can actually solve the issue at hand.
Yeah. And to really understand that we are in the same boat. Yeah, it's not like you are in your boat, I'm in my boat. Yeah, we're both in the same one. And let's try to row the same direction together, yeah, in synchronicity.
Exactly, and life is so hard. I was like, don't fight also with your partner.
That's right.
Too much.
And can you tell us about important relationship skills that many people are perhaps lacking in today's world? Is there any difference to the way how people communicated 50 years back or a couple generations back to the way how we are communicating today, even though we have so much more possibilities of communicating with all of the social media?
It's really interesting. I think in terms of communication, I would say that the biggest problem is actually a lack of respect. And I think that this is trickling down through the generations. So when I watched my grandma and grandpa communicate with each other, it was super harsh, Like they didn't show really any emotions, and it was just like a harsh way of interacting with each other. And then my parents kind of like do the same thing, maybe a little bit less harsh, but it's still there. What I said before with learning boundaries and learning connection, I would say really including respect in your relationship is like the most important thing. Because if you don't have this base level of respect, like how can you ever expect to be a team? And people are never going to like open up to you if they think that whenever there's a little problem or, you're in a bad mood, you're just going to lash out on them. It's just not going to happen. So it's such a simple thing, but I'm sometimes really shocked when I go in the supermarket or something and see how people interact with each other. It's like, whoa,
Yeah.
Do you have that too? Like,
oh,
do
yes.
you see that?
Yes, that's why sometimes it's actually uncomfortable for me to be in supermarkets. I prefer to stay in the car because then I do not have to deal with all of these inputs. Yeah, because I'm all the time like recepting. I'm watching other people. I'm always listening, and I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, oh no. So it's sometimes really painful to see how people just communicate with each other.
Totally. Yeah. For me, it's the same. And then, of course, also with children, that they are so harsh often with the little ones.
Yeah.
It's really shocking for me. But I also want to say to anyone here out there that I used to be very much the same. It's actually a big story of mine that I used to be so harsh with my partner and just like rude because, that's what I had picked up. And luckily, a few years ago, I became so aware of this and I was able to change this, and the connection and intimacy and friendship in my relationship that is brought is so amazing. And now we really love being with each other, and this is something where I think a lot of people also feel that maybe on some level their spouse really hates them or, doesn't really like them. And that's a terrible feeling. But on the other hand, if you treat each other like this, it kind of makes sense. So it can be a beautiful shift just to bring this respect. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. Actually, in the Western world, there has a bit of a different phenomenon been taking place, which is called the nice guy syndrome, which actually is men who really, really struggle to stand up for themselves. And that's actually a lot of my work that I focus on. And not to say, of course, there are still, relationships where women get dominated and maybe men are misogynistic and stuff. But actually now we often have the problem that women get very domineering and almost like get into the masculine role. And the men kind of like feel a little bit that they don't really have a say in relationships. So that's actually a lot of the men that I coach. So I help them to return and connect a bit with their natural masculinity. And it is so beautiful for relationships. There is also a masculine feminine dynamic that is really healthy and what usually most people really love. And that is that the man is a little bit more in charge and assertive and, pursues the woman, like all those kind of like classical things. And women usually really like it if they can be a little bit more feminine, that they can relax a little bit more in the relationship, that they also give the beautiful gifts of the feminine to the man, which would be like beauty and grace. And in a modern world where just because the way we live, everything is kind of like equal, it can sometimes get a little bit confused. And as I said, the nice guy syndrome has been born out of this confusion. And so many men also feel that, there's something wrong with being masculine because there has been a lot of trauma happened with women in the past. But there is something that is like a healthy, beautiful masculinity, which just means that you're a assertive man and that you know what you want. That's all it is. And of course that, love women and want the best for them, but that you also stand up for yourself. Yeah. So that's very important for a man's health.
Oh, that's extremely interesting. I've not heard it in that perspective, and it definitely makes sense. Thanks for clarifying that one. And one thing that I've also seen in your website, which was very interesting, is the term inner child. So what is the inner child and why is it so important to connect with it?
Oh, beautiful question. Yes. So the inner child is both the part of yourself that stores a lot of unresolved emotions and wounds from childhood. So, what we talked about today, maybe those feelings of being hurt because your parents were not there for you, or being cautious because you felt in childhood that people were too much in your space, not giving you enough freedom. So if there's unresolved emotions, the inner child stores this. But also, when we talk about the inner child, we just also mean the energy of a child, the curiosity, the being in the moment. And that's why it is so beautiful to connect with the inner child when you're doing personal development work, because on the one hand, you can heal those past wounds that often hold you back. Often when we can't progress in life, it is because we have a lot of unresolved baggage that kind of like drags us down. But, we don't want to kind of like cut off that baggage. We want to help and heal those unresolved wounds. You can really imagine you have a little child in you that is maybe quite hurt. And so you as an adult, you can help it. But then also, as you do this more and more, those childlike qualities come back into your life. So you're going to feel so much more joy and just being silly, a little bit playfulness. Those are such beautiful qualities. And as you know, many, many adults are so serious. They're really, really stuck in this kind of like duties and responsibilities, and it can make life so heavy. I always love to do the inner child work with clients that I feel are too serious, and then I give them homework like just go to the park and play with the ball or pick up some leaves or something like this. And they always really love it.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I definitely think that people have forgotten how it is to be a child. I used to be also a trainer. That means in the corporate world, I was training people how to become project managers, and I also gave training on change management. Today, I still give the training, but it's on digital form. But I always encourage that we will learn the concepts by doing games and by playing, because that's how I think people learn much, much better. Because I was always seeing how kids can learn, like the learning curve is so steep at the beginning of their lives because they're just playing all the time and they're learning by playing. And I said, well, why can't I just do the same thing in my courses? So I always try to integrate a lot of games, and people just love it because we're constantly playing. And they're like, wow, the whole day is gone, 8 hours of training, and it just felt like 30 minutes. Even though we were already 8 hours here, because we were most of the time just doing fun stuff and we learned so much. So I think that what you just mentioned is just such an amazing thing, with saying, do not forget to play. That's what children do and what we should also do as adults.
Totally. And right now I think a lot about like parenting, because my husband and I are probably going to have kids next years. And I tell you, I think about this so much because we have this thing also, for some reason we think that children don't want to learn. It's not true, as you said, right? The learning curve is so steep. It's just that we force them to learn in this boring way. And I really loved what you said, because I think one of the best memories of my life are always those when I'm in a group and there's like a really cool leader and he teaches us something exactly in this playful way.
I think that's why maybe the school system is a little bit outdated, the way how they are teaching their kids. And just to say, everybody has to now sit down in the chair, be quiet, don't say anything, don't move, and just listen to me giving you the information. And it's all just a one-way street. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, and that's today. We're in year 2023 and we still have that old styled school system.
Totally. Yes.
And even though that today you have so many experts, yeah, in this case like yourself, who know that there are much better ways of learning and much better ways of communicating with people so that we can be more joyful in life. And I think that could be a big project to do, yeah, to change a little bit the school system.
Oh, I definitely think so. In Germany, you are not even allowed to not send your kids to school. You can't even homeschool. For example, it's not even possible. And that for me is also like a bit of red flags, because I'm thinking, how can you even try out? There has to be some people who try different ways so that we can evolve together, And I see it now in my life how the school system has damaged me, because I have my own business, but still I feel guilty, if I don't sit for 8 hours, or I have all these mechanisms in me that basically make me feel that the only way I do work is if I sit down on the desk and do all these things, and it's often very unproductive, ineffective, and makes me really unhappy. So I have to really consciously train myself to change this, and it's such hard work. And I'm thinking, with my kids, I want to help them that they don't even get to that point, that they constantly have to unlearn all these unhelpful things they have learned in the school. That's one of my big missions in life also.
That's so amazing. So we definitely need to connect and do another podcast in maybe like in 5 years. Yeah. And and I could listen to all those cool things you're doing with your kids.
Everything I said is wrong. You need to control them.
Yeah. Forget about that. Delete that podcast. Yeah. Oh, well, what is your definition of happiness? Because everybody has like their own vision of what is happiness, and what is for you your definition of happiness?
Man, I thought about this question first. I was like, we need to delete this question. It's too big. And I was like, oh, okay, I can answer it. So I think for me, I'm like a connector. It's like my happiness is always so dependent on if I have fulfilling relationships or not. That for me is the most important thing. And I really think that every person has this one thing that is so important for them. And I think very often when people struggle so intensely with mental health is because they don't realize that this is the one thing that they really need to be happy, and there's always a cause for why you are depressed. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. So for me, I get really unhappy if there's not people around me. But the other thing also that I do, and that brings me the most happiness, is dancing. And I actually do it always before my sessions, and also before this podcast. I put the music out and I dance, and it's like just feeling my body, and there's something very mystical, magical about dancing. I don't know, it's like this thing where you just feel your body and you kind of like move in a nonsensical way. It also defies all these theories, that we are just kind of like doing things that make sense. It's like, nah, we are definitely spiritual beings. Yeah, so that's for me, it's connecting with people and dancing.
Wow, that's so amazing. Yeah? And that's why I think if we look at lots of famous people, they have their houses, their big cars, so everything what they wished for, which they envisioned maybe before they were famous. But now that they're famous, they realize that they're still unhappy, and somehow they become more isolated because they say, oh, I'm so famous, I cannot even go out to the street, I cannot go to the supermarket. You have even less relationships with other people. And somehow that isolation of always just being in your big house and your 15 cars, it's not really making you happy, because what makes you happy is, as you said, your connection to other people, your relationships that you have, and being around loved ones. So that's, I think, for a lot of people, the wake-up call, when they think, wow, how come I was so successful, but successful in brackets, successful in life, that I was able to have all that financial freedom, but I'm still somehow unfulfilled inside. My heart is still empty. Yeah. That's quite scary moment or time in your life to be, where you say, well, I thought that was happiness and I thought that was being successful, but at the end it was totally something else.
And I think they often try the so that, they want to reach something so that they can get love or connection or something. And of course it doesn't work. And not to say that there's anything wrong with having material goals, but I think it's very important to understand, why do I want something? Because I think some people generally enjoy for example, the acting or the being entrepreneur or something. But a lot of people have this in mind because they think then finally people will love them or they will have friends. Not to realize that what is actually the byproduct, for example, of fame. I think for me it would be like the most terrible thing. I would never want to be famous in that level because you're actually becoming quite a slave, eh? I mean, you can't really do anything. So yeah, it's very important to not just realize what do I want, but why. And maybe you're even going to change it. Yeah, your goal.
Yeah. So it's amazing how fast time flies because I'm just looking at the timer. I'm like, wow, we're already way over 1 hour. It's so interesting to have this conversation with you. But I do have one final question, which is about your services that you have for your clients. So what do you offer your clients?
I do relationship coaching with them. So I do one-on-one work. I work both with men and women, both in relationships and single. And with men, I focus on how to help them feel more respect in their relationships, because this is one of the areas that, as I said, the men more struggle with maybe being not so assertive, being not so confident. They often feel this lack of respect, but that's actually the number one most important need for men. And it's a very beautiful process because every man has this very naturally within them. So I just empower them a little bit, very softly and gently. And they always are so much more happy afterwards. And with women, I focus on their femininity. So I help them to be more relaxed in their relationships, let the men take care of them, have a more an open heart. Then very naturally, men like gravitate towards them and want to actually have more intimacy and connection. This is often what women are suffering from. And I also do a women's circle, an online one, which is every 2 weeks, which is super beautiful. I do also coach the women in there a little bit. And we focus again of being more feminine women. So this is right now what I offer. And maybe in the future, I also do some couples coaching. Maybe that's coming.
It sounds very exciting and compelling, especially after hearing all the things that you gave as input today. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people interested to find out more. Before we close the podcast, is there one thing that you could give our listeners that they could immediately put into action after this podcast? Like maybe some kind of tool or some kind of relationship tip that you could give us?
Yes. If you go on the internet and you look for a needs list on Google, download it. And then pick your number 3 needs that you have. So needs would be something like connection, communication, intimacy, freedom, autonomy, all those kind of things. So you pick your 3 things and then you examine all your relationships and you think about, are these needs met? Because the needs will show you, for example, if you are really unhappy in your relationship and you don't really know why, what's happening, it usually means that your most important needs are not met. And then, at the same time, it's a solution as well, right? Because it shows you, this is actually what I'm missing here. So it's kind of like a tool to analyze both the problems that you're experiencing, but also the solutions that can help you to feel better.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And last but not least, where can we find you when we want to look for you?
So, of course, I have my website with all my offers. But if you want to connect with me, I do actually weekly webinars on Meetup. So go and find the Conscious Relationship School on meetup.com. And every Wednesday, I give webinars about what men and women want in relationships, how to communicate better, how to set boundaries, and so on and so forth. And it's really fun and I make it entertaining and you can learn a lot. So yeah, find me there.
Fantastic. I'll be putting that into the show notes. So anybody listening to this and cannot take notes at this moment, then they can just click on the links on the show notes and that makes it much easier. So thank you so much, Veronika, for this conversation we had today. It was really amazing and I hope it brought lots of value to the listeners. And we would probably do another podcast sometime in the future. Maybe the next one we could do it in German for the German listeners.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be fun. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. It was really wonderful.
What a magnificent conversation. I hope this episode with Veronika has made you curious about the way we have relationships with people and how that affects our overall well-being, health, happiness, and longevity. I encourage you to pick at least one action point from today's episode and see how it positively impacts your energy. Tell me what you have tried and what outcome you have experienced and tag me on Instagram. My account is health_happiness_planet. For me, I will integrate the mindset of connecting even more with my inner child and incorporate the playfulness so that learning can be even more fun. In the show notes, you will find the links on where to find Veronika and how to contact her. This podcast was sponsored by Wave Business Excellence Footprint, a digital training company that cares about your career development, your personal development, and the well-being of this planet we call home. On our website, www.wave-bef.com, you will find a total of 22 courses. 7 of those are designed for managers, and 15 courses are designed for employees who strive to become the leaders of tomorrow. I value your feedback and I would love to hear from you. Please rate, subscribe, and share this episode with your loved ones. Your support means the world to me and it motivates me to keep on producing content that adds value to your life. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Big hugs, everyone.